So today, Jesus tells us this very familiar parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. This story has such commonality to us, but it speaks with such power and clarity that even those who, have no belief in God, a Good Samaritan, that's just popular parlance. We use it in ordinary language, whether or not we're a person of faith. There's actually even laws called Good Samaritan laws that protect people who help others who are in danger or have been injured, right? But as familiar as the story may be, and as common as that term, the Good Samaritan, may be, Jesus wants us to go deeper than the surface, right? Than the way we commonly think about this story. He wants to enter, with all parables, it's the whole point of a parable. It's intended that you enter into it through pondering, and it's never supposed to be incredibly explicitly clear. It draws you in, and you have to kind of wrestle with it. That's the whole point of a parable. And in doing that, in that interaction with the parable, you enter into it, and that's what Jesus is inviting people to do. That's what Jesus is inviting us to do, to enter into and ponder the parable so that we can live it. That's the ultimate goal. So the parable that Jesus tells begins with a question, right? The question is this. There was a scholar of the law who stood up, that's very important, to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, the question is asked by a lawyer, a scholar of the law of Moses, right? We heard some of the law of Moses in the first reading from the book of Deuteronomy today. So there are Jews of Jesus' time that are scholars of the law, and they're trained to think, debate, and dissect every word of the Torah, right, the Jewish Bible. So his question sounds sincere. I mean, it really sounds like a sincere question. "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" But as we know, it's anything but sincere. Luke tells us his motive. He wanted to test Jesus. He's trying to make Jesus look like a fool among the other scholars of the law. He wasn't trying to understand, right? So it wasn't a real question, was it? It's an attempt to make Jesus look bad, and so he gave Jesus a sign of respect. What did he do? He called him rabbi. That's a term or teacher, right? A term of great respect. And when you're teaching, you sit at the foot of a rabbi when you're a disciple. A disciple is one who sits at the feet of a teacher. So rather than sit at Jesus' feet in a posture of a real desire to learn, he stands up, a posture of superiority and authority. So he's asking the question, but he's actually body languaging Jesus. "I'm smarter and more powerful than you," right? There's a lot going on here in just a few words. So he stood up. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" He was trying to justify himself, right? Think about an inheritance. Are you supposed to have ultimate control over from whom and how much of an inheritance you get? No, you can't guarantee an inheritance. It's given by somebody else. But that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to guarantee, his place in eternal life. But now, how often do we do the same? I mean, before I sound too condescending about this scholar of the law, I know I have, and on occasion do ask questions that are not real questions. They're posed as questions, but I'm really trying to make a statement and show my superiority, how much I know, right? It just comes out of basic human insecurity, right? So I will admit to doing the same thing, asking questions that aren't real questions. They're statements. Can I get the water, please, that's there? So sometimes we ask questions not to be changed, thank you, or to learn, but to defend our own comfort zones. So like this lawyer, we want to defend or define our own boundaries. We want clearly defined boundaries. We want to know who we can count as our neighbor and who doesn't qualify as our neighbor, so we can love the right people and ignore the rest. But Jesus, you know, as always, especially in Luke's gospel, Luke loves flipping the situation. Jesus flips the script. He doesn't respond with a lecture or a rule book. Instead, he tells a story, a simple but piercing story about human need and indifference and mercy. And left half dead on the side of the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. Now, this is the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. It's a very tricky road. It's a very dangerous road. And it's mountainous, and it's easy for robbers to hide and then go back to hiding after, you know, coming upon their victims. So this is the road, I mean, that the parable takes place on. And while there's a victim on this side of the road, a priest comes by, a man of God, respected and holy. He sees the man and crosses to the other side of the road. A Levite comes next. The Levites are also religious figures committed to the temple, and he too sees the man and walks away. Now they excuse themselves from responding to the need, presumably, because Jewish law indicates that when a holy person, or anybody really, comes in contact with blood or death, they're defiled. They're considered unclean until they go through a cleansing ritual. So to be pristine, they may have been avoiding contact with this half-dead man. Then comes the Samaritan. Now this would have shocked Jesus' audience, that he now places in the role as the model to emulate a Samaritan. Jews and Samaritans were enemies. They had a long history of division, prejudice, bitterness. So for Jesus to make a Samaritan the hero of the story was unthinkable, offensive even. Samaritans were considered inferior because they intermarried, right? They didn't stay pure. They married non-Jews. And yet it's the Samaritan who sees, stops, touches, right? Breaks kind of the strict law of not coming in contact with blood. So he touches and heals and pays, right? He doesn't ask the man's religion, nationality, or net worth. He sees a human being in pain and he chooses compassion. That's the key. He chooses compassion. So this story is not just about being a good Samaritan and helping people in need. It's about how we define neighbor. The lawyer asks, who is my neighbor? Why? Because he wants to know who he needs to care about and who he can forget about, right? But Jesus responded, with a question again. Who was the neighbor in the story? And it was, of course, the man in need. And so you see the shift. It's not about asking who qualifies to be loved. It's about becoming the kind of person who loves without qualification, not asking, well, I might help you, I might love you, I might even like you, but let me check your qualifications first, right? So that's the deeper challenge of this gospel. It's not just about, we often think about the Good Samaritan, thinking, well, we should help people who are injured or in need or in threat of harm. The gospel is much more about this concept of who is my neighbor. So Jesus ends the parable not with praise for this scholar of the law who gives all of the right answers, but he tells, go and do likewise. Do this and you will live. Meaning, stop thinking and debating and arguing about the points of the law and go live it for Christ's sake. Although he wouldn't say for Christ's sake. Don't just think about it. Don't feel inspired by it. Do it. So our faith, means little if it just stays in our minds, if it's a head trip for us. So the priest and the Levite, they may have had all of the right theology, but they failed in action. So the Samaritan, considered unclean and heretical, lived the heart of God's law, to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is a parable, and we have to ask ourselves, do we see ourselves in this story, or where do we see ourselves in this story? Right? Maybe you feel like the wounded man, broken, abandoned, in need of mercy. If so, know this: Christ himself is your good Samaritan. He sees you. He has compassion. He binds up your wounds, and he carries you off to be healed. So you also may feel like the Samaritan, moved with compassion for a world in pain. Great. Keep living that message. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't wait for anybody else. Step in. Love generously. But if we're honest, many of us are like the priest and the Levite. We care, we mean well, but we're busy. We're cautious. We don't want to get involved. We're overwhelmed by the needs around us, and it's easier to cross to the other side. I think today especially of the immigration crisis that we face. Most agree our immigration policy needs reform because nations need to be able to protect their borders, right? And they need to know who's coming and going, right? However, I am disgusted and heartbroken with how mass deportation policy is being carried out. This is a quote I want to share with you from a letter that our Archbishop, Cardinal McElroy, signed along with many other bishops across the country and leaders of other faith, rabbis and leaders of Protestant faiths. Can I get that quote? There it is. It's a little long. Our faith organizations, meaning the people who have signed this letter, have long favored the creation of legal avenues for migration and a legalization program for immigrants who have lived in the U.S. for years and contributed their hard work to our economy. We believe the adoption of these policies, instead of the implementation of a mass deportation campaign, would not only benefit immigrant workers and their families, but be in the best interest of our nation. The question, should immigration reform consist of violently apprehending honest, hardworking people at their places of employment? There's so many people who are afraid to show up to work now, talk to their employers and how they're struggling. Some say that undocumented immigrants should enter the country legally. Well, most people have absolutely no idea how difficult it is to pursue legal status in the United States. The process is highly complicated, lasting for decades, and is impossible for people who don't have higher education and the economic means. Unless you're a person of great power and prestige, because I could give you a couple examples of people who have made their way through in practically no time, right? But they happen to know somebody. So the system is broken. But is arresting parents in front of their children by agents who are dressed in full military gear the right way to fix the system? Immigrants have been labeled as horrible, horrible criminals. My father entered this country illegally. Do I look like the typical undocumented immigrant that people think of? He was 14, an orphan, and came to this country by himself, which was illegal for a person that age to enter the country unaccompanied by an adult. So what did he do? He lied about his age. You know, you grow up an orphan, you get tough, and you kind of, mature a little more quickly so he could pass as a 16-year-old. And that's what he did. But that was illegal. Or it was, but he wasn't a criminal, right? Wasn't a criminal. Came to this country and contributed a lot, right? Yes, some undocumented immigrants are criminals, but the vast majority are not. They are our neighbors. So these are complex issues, and they're hard to grapple with, but we can't ignore the inhumanity of the current deportation process. And the question we have to do is, what can we do? If they are our neighbors, that's a serious question I have to ask myself. What can I do? Today, Jesus lovingly confronts us in the same way he confronted the lawyer who wanted to guarantee his eternal life, right? Trying to test Jesus, make him look like a fool. The man more interested in defining neighbor so he could exclude anyone else from his concern. But Jesus gave him the example of the Good Samaritan. And he said, which of these three, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim? And the lawyer answers, the one who treated him with mercy. Notice here, he can't even bring himself to put the word neighbor and Samaritan in the same sentence. He can't do it. He can't do it. But he did say, the one who treated him with mercy. At least he got that far. So Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. So today, let us ask not, who is my neighbor? Or how do I define my neighbor? But ask, to whom can I be a neighbor? Because like Jesus, we can see beyond boundaries and qualifications and categories. We love, not just in words, but in action. So let's continue on the road of mercy that Jesus invites us on, following the footsteps of Christ, who is our true Good Samaritan.